How's it going, everyone? Scott Foxhoven here, coming to you from the University of Illinois in Dr. Fred Belo's lab. A lot of you guys have probably heard Dr. Belo speak before. Maybe it was on the 6 Secrets of Soybean Success, or maybe even the 7 Wonders of the Corn Yield World. Well, today what I want to talk to you about is some of the barriers, benefits, and breakthroughs of some of the research that we've been doing with banding and broadcasting fertilizers. So a little bit about me. I actually grew up in northeast Nebraska on a small cattle farm, Foxhoven Cattle Company. So I'm not too far from here, about 2.5 hours. I actually went to South Dakota State University, where I got an undergraduate degree in agronomy. And from there, I went to the University of Illinois. I've gotten my master's with Dr. Belo, and now my PhD. One of the really interesting things when you go from state to state is seeing how different ag changes when you go from east to west across the country. Nebraska, you're going to see a lot of center pivot irrigation. A lot of guys, you just drive along I-80 in Nebraska, this is everywhere. In Illinois, it would pretty much be a festering swamp if it wasn't for tile drainage. Now I can tell you in 2019, no amount of tile drainage was ever going to stop the flooding. But I'm going to try and not dwell too much on the bad weather in 19 and now even 2020 a little bit. What I do want to talk about is some of our research overview, a little bit of background of what is small plot research. That, and then we're going to go over the agronomics and economics of fertilizer placement. And then I'll bring it to really how hybrid makes a difference in an operation. Not every hybrid is created equal. And then lastly, we'll take a look at a couple key questions. One of those is, does nitrogen and potassium belong in the band? Focusing on nitrogen leaching and potassium safety. Now, I come from an educational background, and I have to have my knowledge tested every couple months to see if I'm actually paying attention. So I'm going to test your guys' knowledge as well. Can anybody here tell me what the world record of corn yield is? And better yet, what is the corn yield gap? Has anybody got some numbers that can shoot out? What's the world record of corn yield? I'm not going to move on until I get a couple. 520. Yeah, 520.
525. I thought it was 543.
It was actually 616 bushels that was broken in 2019. We compare that to the average U.S. yield in 2017, which was a record yield for that year, 177 bushels. The difference between that is what we call the corn yield gap. It's 439 bushels of growing room. That's the difference between what's theoretically possible and what's typical. And we know that high yields do not happen by accident. Nobody accidentally grows 616 bushels per acre, right? In reality, there are 27 national yield contest winners that entered into the NCGA Corn Yield Contest in 2019. Now those winners had yields anywhere from 219 all the way up to 616 bushels per acre. Those 27 winners were divided into 9 different categories. That included where the corn was grown, corn state areas, irrigated, non-irrigated, strip till, or whatnot. And there's 3 winners in each of those categories. All but one of those 27 winners exceeded 300 bushels per acre. 3 exceeded 400, 3 exceeded 500, and 1, as you know, exceeded 600 bushels per acre. Now, if we take a look at the top 10 yields nationwide, you're going to see 382 bushels to 616. Now, outside of the high yield, what I thought was really interesting is that 4 of those top 10 yields actually came from strip till operations. 3 of the top 4, in fact. So if you go and talk to some of these high yield growers and you ask them what is their strategy for winning the corn yield contest, I mean, it's actually a pretty simple answer. You have to feed and protect a higher density of the best racehorse hybrids, that and somehow make sure the crop is never stressed the day of its life. Well, it's a heck of a lot easier said than done. There's a lot of different factors that go into growing high yield, a lot of different steps. One of those very first steps is going to start with crop nutrition. A lot of high yield guys know that that crop needs to sense a certain amount of fertility right from the start. Now we do this using a dry banding toolbar. We actually have a Montag Gen 2 fertilizer box that's mounted on top of a 4-row Dawn Coulter toolbar. Now this allows us to place fertilizer about 4 to 6 inches deep directly below the future crop row. We then use RTK and GPS, and we plant directly over where that fertilized band is. Most of our banding research is done in the spring. Now this is a full-size production toolbar that we've been able to use from Montag. And when I say it's modified for small plot research, a lot of people don't necessarily know what small plot research is. So if I'm going to talk about small plot research, you can take the idea of taking just one, say 5-10 acre field and divvying it up into a bunch of smaller fields. Okay? Those smaller fields are roughly about 4 rows by 40 feet long. What this allows me to do is take 15 different fertility practices and then randomly replicate them 6 different times throughout that field. This allows you to tease out very exact yield differences from different managements within a small area of land. So I could look at a yield difference of, say, 10 bushels from banding nitrogen compared to broadcasting. So this is a good look at what that small plot research is. And if you look, you can really see some very big visual differences from just 4 rows over. Now, we do a lot of this type of research at the Crop Physiology Lab. In just 2020, we put out 128 of these small plot research trials, and that's 15,000 small plots. Now, we do this amount of research with just a 4-row planter. Now, this is not your typical 4-row planter. As you can see, I have 2 guys here on the back of that. For every single one of those 15,000 plots, those 2 guys have to dump a seed packet into a tube. Now, I can tell you that this is by far our favorite activity in the spring. I mean, we use this photo right here as a recruiting tool for graduate students. I mean, there you are, sunny and 75, and just a beautiful day. Kids see this picture like, yeah, I want to do grad school. Until all of a sudden they realize that this is actually what grad school is like on the back of that 4-row planter. So not only do we use a 4-row planter, we also use a 2-row combine. If I'm going to work with a 4-row plot, I'm actually harvesting the very center 2 rows of that 4-row plot. And I can tell you it's a little bit depressing when you're trying to tackle 10 to 100 acres and you're at your off-site location using a farmer's field, and he's got 2 16-row combines doing circles around you with your little 2 to 3 row there. It takes about 30 minutes to dump that thing. By that time, the farmer's almost gone out of that field. But we do work with a couple farmers across the state of Illinois. We have research at 3 different locations. We use Stewart Farms up in northern Illinois. We work on the U of I campus in Champaign, and then Bartling Farms down in southern Illinois. Now, the reason we do a lot of research across the state of Illinois is the natural soil fertility of these 3 locations are very different. Up in northern Illinois, we have some pretty high organic matter, 5.3. Champaign, you're at 3.6. Down in Nashville and Ewing, Illinois, you drop all the way down to 2%. Okay? Now, these 2 right here, phosphorus and potassium, you're also going to see that those 2 are going to decrease as you move south. Now, a lot of people focus on these 2 nutrients when they're looking at that soil test. But I want to know, who here can tell me when that soil test was calibrated to corn yields? When was that soil test calibrated to predict when you would have an economical yield response when fertilizing with phosphorus and potassium? Can everybody give me a decade? 90s, 80s, 40s, 50s, 60s? 1970s? It was actually in the 60s and the early 70s. Now, who can tell me what the yield level was back in the 60s and the 70s? You were only looking at 60 to 100 bushels per acre. So I can tell you right now that the soil test has not been calibrated to today's corn yields, especially if I'm going to concentrate that fertilizer in a band. Now, I have proof to show this too. What you're looking at here is the same crop, same day, same hybrid, same planting date, everything. On my right side, I'm banding 100 pounds of P2O5 as microessentials SZ, directly underneath that crop row in the spring. And here, same population, good rate of nitrogen, but I did not fertilize for phosphorus. The reason why is because I had a Malick soil test of 43 ppm for phosphorus. Your typical recommendation is going to say that you do not need any additional phosphorus above 20, 25 ppm. But yet still, we have a huge growth response from having that phosphorus concentrated right where those roots could get to it. Okay? Now, not only is that phosphorus going to help with just early season growth, you're also going to have what we call as a great uniformity of emergence, getting every one of those plants up out of the ground at the same time. Now, if you're relying on broadcast fertility or even just the base soil test, you're going to have what we call as a lot of corn plants left behind. Now this thing right here, this is pretty much a weed. There is nothing you can do to get it to catch up to its two neighbors. I mean, you can go out there and sing to it, you can sleep next to it at night, you can give it a little massage, hell, you can even piss on it. I've done it, it typically makes it worse. There is nothing you can do to this plant to get it to catch up those two neighbors, and now it's pretty much just taken away yield. So some key takeaways. We know that the current fertilizer recommendation is just a broadcast P and K based on that soil test, but that wasn't calibrated for what we're doing today. The future of soil fertility recommendations really needs to be feeding that crop and not just the soil, meeting those core nutrition requirements from year to year. So we know that banding is a great way to achieve that, and so that's why I want to talk about some of the benefits, specifically the agronomics and economics of fertilizer placement. The study I'm going to show you was done in 2019. It was actually a hybrid evaluation study. We looked at 10 hybrids, 110 to 114 day relative maturity. We planted them at 3 populations, 30, 36, and 42,000. Then we had 2 fertility plants. The entire field had a non-limiting N rate of 280 pounds of nitrogen. We wanted to make sure nitrogen was non-limiting. We then either applied 75 pounds of P2O5 as MAP and 60 pounds of K2O as MOP right there, or we just relied on that base rate of nitrogen, the 280 pounds. However, if I was going to fertilize, I looked at 2 different placements. I either did a broadcast incorporation, or I used the subsurface band using that dry toolbar I showed you earlier. Now our soil test here was 25 ppm for phosphorus and 90 ppm for K. So let's just take a look at the response to population from this study. We looked at 30, 36, and 42,000, and I can tell you that 2019 was not a great year for high populations in Champaign. We only had about a 1 bushel yield increase for 36,000, and we even actually went backwards when we tried to bump it up to 42,000. And the reason for that is because the weather in 2019, I had excessively wet soils in May and April. Then I lost about 4 inches right when I needed it most through the heat of the summer. And this was what a lot of fields in Illinois look like. We had great yield potential, roughly 300 bushels, and we just got to watch it melt away all summer long. But even with this tip back here, we still had phenomenal responses to fertility. What you're looking at is average across all those 10 hybrids and those 3 populations. My unfertilized control, which just had that nitrogen, was 203 bushels. I had a 17 bushel yield response to broadcast fertility. However, when I put that same amount of nutrients, just concentrating it into a band, I gained another 8 bushels. And that's average across 10 hybrids and those 3 populations. And the visual growth response that we saw in the field was outstanding. This is the same hybrid, same population, same planting date. You're looking at about a 3 to 4 growth stage advantage from there to there, and that still has the same amount of nutrients. That was the growth response that we saw from placing those nutrients right by that root system. Now this wasn't just one plot that we cherry picked. If you take a drone image of that field, you can see every single plot that I had banded fertility. You can see that growth response across the entire field. So ultimately, we want to know, is this going to pay? Because it really looks pretty. Okay? If I go and look at the 2020 Iowa Custom Farm Rate Survey, I'm going to say that field cultivation, $16, putting a spinner spreader across the field is about $6. So $22 application cost. If I'm going to use the cost of strip tilling and the cost of putting that fertilizer through the strip till rig, add on another $10 per acre. So if I'm going to look at $3.50 corn price, that's about a 3 bushel break even. Okay? So when we look at how this response to fertility looked across populations, so now we're looking across the 10 hybrids, that unfertilized yield was roughly about 200 bushels per acre. We have our 3 populations, 30, 36, and 42. Response to broadcast and banding were actually equivalent when I was only planting 30,000 plants per acre. However, when I went up to 36,000, I had a 9 bushel advantage to banding compared to broadcast. And then that increased even more when I went up to 42,000 plants per acre. Now, not only did my response to placement get bigger with a greater population, but what's really interesting is I had a less response to broadcast as I increased that population. Now, why would I have less of a response to fertility when I'm increasing my population? Well, what happens to a corn plant's root system as you increase population? Well, it's a pretty simple question, pretty simple answer. It gets smaller. Well, now, being in grad school and being from an academic background, we don't get to make too many assumptions. And because you can pretty much hold a degree over a grad student's head and get them to do anything, we actually tried to measure it. We measured it using root washing and root digging. So at the end of the year, after the combine rolled through the field, we went out there with a team of graduate students and shovels. And we went up and dug every one of those plots that represented different populations, hybrids, fertility management. Then we spent a good solid 4 days power washing them so we could see exactly how that root system was going to be affected by these different managements. Now, if you thought planting was fun, this is by far our favorite activity. I mean, look at how happy I am. There's nothing I would rather be doing on a cold November day than power washing roots. And again, we also have the other side. You can just see the sadness on his face. I don't think he liked me after we had to do that. But all that hard work's not for nothing, because this process gives us a great visual demonstration on how that root system is going to be affected as I'm increasing population. When we put the numbers behind that, I'm going to see that when I go from 30,000 to 42,000, when I'm just looking at the weight of that root, I'm losing 15% of that root mass for every 6,000 plants that I put out there. So really what this means, as smaller roots, I'm going to have better population, or better placement. A big question that I get asked is 42,000 plants per acre really necessary? There are a lot of guys even trying to push that high. Well, I answer that with a different question. Can anybody tell me how corn yields have increased over time? What you're looking at here is the U.S. average grain yield from 1960 all the way to 2020. Little by little, every year it's gone up. You have a couple weather fiascos, that's 2012, we all remember that one. But for the most part, it's gone up a little bit every single year. Well, I'm going to overlay the average U.S. planting density over the same time frame. What you're going to see is that on average, population has increased about 400 plants per acre per year. And there's definitely some areas that are a heck of a lot higher than 32,000 plants per acre. So basically what you're going to see is that greater planting populations are going to demand a better management of fertility. And a better way to achieve that fertility from our research has been through subsurface banding. Now, even though we've seen that banding has had great benefits, there's also going to be some barriers that are there, and I want to talk you guys through some of those. Specifically, this statement right here. Not all hybrids are created equal. What we're looking at here is the same set of data, those 10 hybrids, 3 populations, and whatnot. We're looking at the range in response for those 10 hybrids. So up here I have 30 to 42,000 for broadcast and 30 to 42,000 for banding. Over here I'm going to pop up the minimum response that we had of those 10 hybrids and the maximum response. And this is to broadcast fertility. You're looking at anywhere from a 19 to a 35 bushel response in how one of those hybrids responded to that fertility compared to another one. We see the same thing with banding, anywhere from 22 up to 30 bushels. And I had one hybrid that had a 43 bushel response to that banded fertility. Now when I compare the cost of fertilizer, and if I'm trying to make that fertilizer pay within 1 year, broadcast I'm looking about 23 bushels, banding 26 bushels, the hybrid that I chose was going to make a huge difference. So right there, I can tell you that hybrid selection is going to be crucial. It's really the difference between picking a racehorse and a workhorse hybrid. Now that name's been thrown around a lot. How in the heck do you find racehorse hybrids and workhorse hybrids? Well, in 2019, we actually put out a hybrid evaluation study across the state of Illinois. We put out 47 commercial hybrids, 36 per each location, from 6 different seed brands. Now these are not just any run-of-the-mill hybrids. These are all paid hybrid entries into this trial. So each company is putting their top-of-the-line genetics into this trial to see what these hybrids can perform as if they're highly managed. So it's not just some run-of-the-mill hybrid. Anywhere from 103 to 120-day maturity. Now we tested these 47 hybrids at 5 additive levels of management. So we saw how all 47 of these hybrids were performed at standard management first. That standard management was broadcasting P and K, 100 pounds of P2O5 and 75 pounds of K2O as MAP and MOP. And we did that regardless of the soil test. So that's some pretty aggressive rates just from the start. And that's whatever the soil test said, we applied that. 180 pounds of nitrogen, 36,000 plants per acre, no fungicide in a 30-inch row. Now, we also looked at 4 additive levels of management. So we wanted to see, on top of that standard, how did the hybrids all respond to an extra 60 pounds of nitrogen Sidedress? How did they respond if I changed that program to an intensive fertility program? I took the phosphorus, changed it to microessentials SZ, and banded it directly underneath the row. Then I also looked at broadcasting Aspire. Then we also looked at how every one of these hybrids is going to respond to fungicide, and then lastly, how they were going to respond to some of those high populations, 44,000. Now, because I say it's additive, this treatment right here, when I look at that high population, it also had a fungicide, intensive fertility, and extra nitrogen Sidedress. So it's an additive approach. Now, the state of Illinois has definitely got some different yield environments in it. We have some pretty high yields up in Yorkville and Champaign, and then that drops off a little bit when we go down to southern Illinois. So for the sake of time, I'm going to average the results of these 2 locations together and then show you southern Illinois separate. So we're looking at southern Illinois. Across those 36 hybrids, 120 bushels per acre on average, anywhere from 78 to 145 bushels. The hybrid response average was only 2 bushels for nitrogen Sidedress. I had a 19 bushel yield response of all of those hybrids when I banded that MES10 or MESE directly underneath the row. And that's compared to a crop that had already been broadcast with MAP and MOP. Fungicide, we actually went backwards, lost 7 bushels. It was really interesting on average. High population, 44,000 plants per acre on some tougher ground in southern Illinois was not a good idea. But what's really interesting is this right here. Again, how those hybrids varied in their response to these different managements. Some of those hybrids really did not like fungicide at all. Some of them liked it a lot, similar with intensive fertility. What I really want to direct your attention to is this number right here. A lot of people do not think that you can aggressively manage poor ground, specifically when it comes to nutrition. And I can tell you that high fertility is not only meant for a high-yielding environment. That tougher ground is sometimes where you're going to find the best response to that added fertility or that placement. Now let's take a look at northern and central Illinois average. Yield's gone up quite a bit, 243 bushels per acre. The nitrogen Sidedress, now I had a 7 bushel yield increase with that. Intensive fertility was only 3 bushels this time. Fungicide, I had a 10 bushel yield response, and then that high population was a 1 bushel yield response. Now, since I'm adding all of these together with this population, high population right there, that enhanced management was worth about 21 bushels per acre. Not really that beautiful if I'm considering all the cost of this. But again, I'm going to bring your attention back to how those hybrids are going to change and how they respond to those managements. So to give you a really good real-world example of this, we're going to pull up 6 hybrids from this study. We're looking at 113 to 116 day here on the top. Those standard yields, 236 to 249. When I had that enhanced management, all those inputs, really not that great. Only a 10 bushel yield increase here. This one went backwards too with all those inputs. Okay? Now what you're looking at here is these bottom ones. I'm looking 239, 219, 228. Similar yield environment. But I had a massive response to that management. 301 with 110 day, 309, upwards of an 81 bushel yield response to those factors that we added up together. So what you're looking at here is your workhorse hybrid and your racehorse hybrids. Okay, so what in the heck is a workhorse hybrid or a racehorse hybrid? Well, if you look at a seed guide, you're going to see your racehorse hybrids labeled as your offensive hybrid. It's going to be the one that says push this on really good ground, high populations, and it's probably going to be a little bit more responsive. Your defensive hybrid is going to be stable across yield environments. It handles stress really well, but it might not have that high yield potential. It might not be as responsive. So what do you call a hybrid that is both a workhorse and a racehorse? It's got a little bit of characteristics from both. I mean, you got to stick with the horse theme, right? So it could be nothing other than a unicorn. I mean, but let's be real. Unicorns don't exist, and for that reason, we're going to stick with the workhorse and the racehorse definition. So I'm going to bring up a new definition for these two. I'm going to say that your racehorse hybrid is your small-rooted hybrid, and your workhorse hybrid is your large-rooted hybrid. When I say that, I'm talking about your small-rooted hybrids. They're not going to have that root-to-soil contact that a large-rooted hybrid is going to have. And that's going to make a difference on mining the soil for phosphorus and potassium, those two nutrients that really rely on root-to-soil contact. Okay, so your small-rooted hybrids, they're going to have less root crowding. That's going to result in a little bit of a higher yield potential. Nobody likes to be crowded at the dinner table. But it's going to be more susceptible to stress. If I don't have good fertility right where that small root system is, it's not going to be able to mine the soil. We can compare that to a large-rooted hybrid. You're going to have more of that below-ground root crowding. It's probably going to have a little bit lower yield potential, but you're going to handle that stress better. Okay? A lot of the times, this one in a tougher year is going to yield a little bit better. But what happens if I try and remove some of that stress and I add banded fertility? I overcome that crop's ability, or the lack of the ability, to get to that P and K that it doesn't have the root system there for. Now you're going to see that these small-rooted hybrids, those are going to be the ones that are going to be more responsive to that fertility. Maybe hit some of those higher top-end yields. Whereas this is that hybrid that you just might not see it really respond to a whole lot. It's not going to be lower yielding. It's just not going to be the hybrid that you push. So we go back to here. I'm going to say that these are your large-rooted hybrids and these are your small-rooted hybrids. And that's what you have to really have a good idea of. What hybrids are you trying to push with some more aggressive fertility or whatnot? So key takeaways. I think I drove it home that hybrids are going to differ in how they respond to fertility. And then a lot of our evidence has shown that small-rooted hybrids tend to be those ones that are going to respond to that added management. Now lastly, let's go through some of the breakthroughs that we've had with some of this research. Specifically, putting nitrogen and potassium in the band. A lot of guys have done phosphorus and done really good with it. These are the two nutrients that I think there's a couple more questions behind them. Specifically, nitrogen leaching and potassium safety. So I'm going to ask you guys a question. What factor has the biggest impact on nitrogen availability from year to year? I can tell you, if you don't know this answer, I don't know if you're actually farming, because it's the weather. Everybody knows that weather impacts nitrogen availability. I mean, I'm pretty sure I can see some nitrogen loss right there, right? It's not unknown that everybody knows that nitrogen availability is impacted by the weather. But what not a lot of people know are some of these key questions regarding placement and nitrogen. Specifically, is banded nitrogen going to be more susceptible to N loss through leaching? Also, is split applying nitrogen going to be better than putting it all up front? That's a really big question, and I think it has to get answered almost every other year. And then lastly, what is the best source and placement for nitrogen going to be? There's a lot of key questions that we want to try and get answers to. And so in 17 and 18, we put out a nitrogen management study across those three locations. So you're looking at multiple yield environments across multiple years. What we did was we looked at a base rate of 180 pounds of nitrogen. We had 3 upfront treatments. We either put it all out as urea broadcast. We used ESN broadcast. ESN is environmentally smart nitrogen. It's 4400, and it's got a poly coat around it to make it slow release. And we also wanted to see what happens if we put that slow release banded directly underneath the row in the spring. And then if we weren't going to use all up front, we looked at a 50-50 Sidedress. We put 50 pounds of nitrogen up front as urea broadcast. And we either came back and Sidedressed with top dressing at V6, putting UAN down the very middle of the row, surface dribble, or putting that UAN right by the crop row with a Y drop. And then just to make it confusing, we put up 2 50-50 treatments where I had 50% of my nitrogen banded up front as urea, and then come back and 50% top dressed. Similar treatment with ESN. So we had our upfront placement options was either going to be broadcast incorporating or using a subsurface band. And then our sources were either urea or ESN. And I can tell you that both source and placement had a huge impact in this trial. What you're looking at is August in Champaign, Illinois. This is the same crop same hybrid, everything about it, 180 pounds of nitrogen pre-plant. You're looking at ESN banded on the left, urea broadcast on the right. This is a very common practice, just putting a weed and feed program, say it was UAN, all your nitrogen up front, just broadcast. You have a huge visual plant health going into August, right when that grain field is really starting to come back to completion. So we said that high-yielding corn starts with better crop nutrition, but you also have to make sure the crop is never stressed. And that is where your nitrogen Sidedress option comes in. You can either put that nitrogen down the very middle of the row, or you can put it right next to the row. Well, where are those corn plants' roots located? In the middle of the row or underneath the row? I know. It took us, so many root digs to finally find out that those roots are actually underneath the row. Who would have known? I can tell you that if I put the nitrogen right there, I'm probably going to have a little bit better efficiency compared to if I put it right over there. This is a fancy instrument called a rulerometer. We use this a lot in grad school. I can actually quantify the fact that those roots only go about 7 to 8 inches. So if I'm putting it 15 inches across the row, how much of that nitrogen do you think is actually going to get into that? Well, this is a picture of a crop that had UAN put down the middle of the row. Wouldn't look all too bad unless you had this one sitting right next to it. Having that nitrogen right next to that crop row really made a big difference on late season nitrogen availability and overall crop health. So let's take a look at the yields from this trial. Upfront treatments, standard grower practice was 238 bushels across those 3 locations. Having that little bit of the slow release source, ESN, was worth 3. When I had that ESN banded directly underneath that row, concentrating it up front and having some slow release there, 17 bushel yield difference. Now, if I wasn't going to put it all up front and I was just going to do a 50-50 split, if I just top dressed it onto the surface, I might as well just put it all out up front, 238 bushels. You add extra application cost. If I put that nitrogen where those crop roots couldn't actually get to it, I was worse off, loss of 4 bushels. If I was going to put that nitrogen right where the roots could actually get to it, that was worth about 7 bushels on average. Now we have those 2 one-off treatments. I was really impressed by this. Urea banded and urea top dress was 11 bushels. You're going to compare this right here to this treatment right there. 238, this is the effect of concentrating that nitrogen up front. If you can trick that plant into thinking there's more nitrogen available there, you're going to be able to get to that Sidedress a lot better without having nutrient deficiency. And then last, we also had the benefit of having that slow release source, ESN, in the band as well, a 15 bushel yield increase. And we had the question, if I'm going to put that nitrogen below the soil surface and already start it lower, am I going to have greater nitrogen leaching loss? The answer is no. What you're looking at here is total N uptake. Another graduate student's favorite time is cutting down plants, grinding them up, and analyzing them for nitrogen. And then we can actually convert the total N uptake to a per acre basis. So you're going to see that when I had that ESN banded, by far had the highest amount of total N uptake. When I was banding with urea and ESN, even though I still had like urea right there, it's not a slow release source, still had greater N uptake. That's overall less nitrogen being lost to the environment, even though I was concentrating it underneath the row. So that right there helps you get an idea of really what it means when you're concentrating that nitrogen. If you have greater yield, you're going to be removing more nitrogen, more nutrients from the environment, which is a good thing, especially when it comes to the environmental standpoint. So key takeaways here. Placing nitrogen near that root system is going to be crucial for better N management. And what we've seen is, regardless of source, placing that nitrogen right near that crop root was going to be way better than any surface applied nitrogen you had. So then one more breakthrough. We talked about potassium in the band, really focusing on K safety. Another question, what is the largest limiting factor when it comes to supplying K fertility to corn? Now this one not a lot of people might have heard of before, and if you had heard of it, you hate it about as much as I do. And it's K fixation. Well, what in the world is K fixation? K fixation, because potassium, of the 3 cations that plants take up, calcium, magnesium, and potassium, because potassium's unique ionic size, it can actually fit in between clay layers when you have shrinking and swelling from wetting and drying cycles. Now, when that potassium becomes stuck in between those clay layers, it's a lot less plant available. At some point or another, that plant can get to it, but definitely not near as quickly as those nutrients that are held on the exchange sites, what you guys know as CEC. So when I have a broadcast K application, and it's just a couple granules for every unit of soil, a large amount of that potassium can actually become fixed in between those clay layers, and it's not really available when that crop's really trying to take it up. Now, if I can overcome that K fixation by banding it, you're going to have a lot of potassium concentrated, and you're going to be able to actually overcome K fixation. You're still going to have the same amount get fixed in between those clay layers, but because I'm making it more concentrated, you're also going to have a heck of a lot more actually available for that crop. Now, the big question is banding it going to be safe? Potassium's a salt. Salt at high concentrations can be a little bit harmful for young plants. So we put out a study in 2018 where we wanted to look at potassium safety. We had two different sources of K. Aspire, which is potash with 0.5% of boron, and then just typical potash 0060. We ran those two products at 4 different rates, from 0, 60, 120, and all the way up to 180 pounds of K2O. The idea was to purposely smoke the crop. I wanted to see something die. And for that reason, we had 2 different placements, broadcast and banding. Now, because we were expecting to smoke the crop with 180 pounds of K2O, our band was put 3 inches offset. And because we also thought we were going to have some emergence issues, the very first thing we did was went out there and took an emergence rating of how uniform the crop was going to come up. So on this left side, we have our K2O rate from 0, 60, 120 to 180. We have our broadcast aspire and mirrored of potash, banded aspire and mirrored of potash. Now, this emergence rating wasn't necessarily like how many plants made it up out of the soil eventually. It was just how uniform did that crop come up within that first 24 hours of emergence. So when we look on this broadcast side, we really didn't see a big difference between sources. So I'm going to direct your attention to the average here. A 9.3, I'm going to say that 7% of that crop came up just a little bit slower. Right there, maybe about 9%. Really not a big deal. All the plants came up within 24 hours. On banding, however, we noticed that when I had a little bit slower emergence of those banding plots as I increased that K2O. I can tell you, they all eventually came up. They just, within 24 hours, they came up a little bit slower. Give you a look at what this looked like out in the field. This left side, 300 pounds of potash broadcast. That's 180 pounds of K2O treatment. On this right side, same amount of potassium, except I banded it 3 inches off to that side. Here's a close-up look here. You can see all those plants are pretty uniform coming out of that ground. On this right side, they're still coming up. You got one there, one here, but they're just slower. Now, why in the world would this one come up? There was no salt injury. It just simply came up slower. So why could that be? Well, potassium attracts water. Water moves from an area of low salt concentration to high salt concentration. So what we're going to say is that band of potassium right next to that crop row, you're actually pulling moisture away from that seed, and it could possibly be taking just a little bit longer to imbibe moisture, because this evened out within 24 hours. Now, when I first told somebody that, they were like, wow, you must hear the potassium sucking the water from out in the field. But it's actually not too hard to believe when you look at this right here. 2017, we put out a side trial. Dr. Bilo likes to kill corn. We put out 2,000 pounds of potash broadcast, just painted the soil red. And what we noticed is after it rained and it started to dry up, within this field we had little 400 square foot blocks where it stayed wetter longer. So this gives you a visual demonstration of what's happening in that band. But now you get to see it on the soil surface. That potassium is holding on to that moisture longer. And that is why we see a little bit of that difference in how quickly that crop's going to come up. Now, when we saw that, we were really expecting that the crop was going to be either visually shorter or stunted in some way because it had a little bit of that slower emergence. That actually wasn't the case. Here we have an unfertilized control, so it had base fertility, just no potassium applied. This right side, I banded 120 pounds of K2O of Aspire. Really good growth response right there. And it wasn't just the fact of potassium, but it was actually placement. My left side, 180 pounds of K2O Aspire broadcast, this right side banding. What we noticed was in the middle of that summer, the water shut off. And this crop that had adequate amounts of potassium available to it was actually able to overcome a little bit of that dry weather, and we saw that it just kept growing a little bit longer. Tasseled a little bit later, like a day or two later, just overall larger growth. And we were a little bit worried that even with taller plants, we might have had a little bit loss of stand from that shorter emergence or delayed emergence. So same slide setup. We have those K2O rates on the left. Broadcast, my target was 36,000 plants per acre. Really didn't have any effect to final stand for broadcast. With banding, still didn't have any response or any negative stand issues with banding. And when we look at grain yield is the most important. That's what makes the world go round. This was actually really disappointing. When I looked at my response to yield for broadcast applications, I went backwards 7 bushels with a broadcast K application, average across the two sources. Went back 3 bushels when I went up to 120. Only gained 1 bushel when I went to 180 pounds of K2O broadcast. Remember when I was talking about K fixation, where if you're broadcasting that, that's really hard to get that K into the crop when you have the ability to fix potassium like we do in Illinois. There's a lot of soils around the world that have this, especially in the US. This right here is the outcome of K fixation. Now when I look at these banding treatments on this right side, again, we really didn't have a huge consistent difference with source, so I'm going to direct your attention right here. 223 versus 239 at 60 pounds of K2O, 227 versus 244, 231 to 249. I was expecting to smoke the crop with 180 pounds of K2O banded that close to the seed, but yet that was by far our highest yielding treatments. That is the difference of concentrating that potassium and being able to overcome that K fixation, keeping it available throughout the season. Now, what if the K was banded directly underneath the row? A lot of guys, if they're strip tilling or if they're banding fertilizer, it's right underneath the row. So in 2018, we also put out a potassium source study. We looked at 3 different sources, just straight potash, and we blended potash with K-Mag, which has got magnesium and sulfur in it. It's a mosaic product. And then also this product here, Poly 4. It's a multi-nutrient K source. You got some magnesium, calcium, and then also sulfur. And it's interesting because it's got some slow release characteristics too. Okay? So the treatments that we had a no potassium control, just 75 pounds of K2O as mirrored to potash, a blend of potash and K-Mag to meet 75 and 25, and then also a blend of potash and Poly 4 for that 75 pounds of K2O, 25 pounds of sulfur. And we broadcasted these 4, and we banded them directly underneath the row this time. And again, we wanted to look to see if we had any issues with banding effects on final stand. So our 4 treatments here, broadcast and banding, no difference. I actually somehow ended up with a couple extra plants from the banding. What you're really seeing is that there's no difference in final stand from banding, even having that potassium right underneath that row. Now I remind you, we're working with a Coulter toolbar. A Coulter toolbar is just going to have a disc opener that's blowing it down about 4 to 6 inches deep. So you can even have a little bit of the stratification of fertilizer up into that seed furrow. So I can tell you if there's going to be a management practice that's safe with Coulter toolbars, I would also venture to guess that it's going to be quite safe with the Shank toolbar as well. And then we look at grain yield for this study. Broadcast. I actually went backwards again with broadcast potash. Mirrored to potash and K-Mag, even having some of that sulfur, I still didn't have that yield response. Broadcast with the Poly 4, having a little bit of that slow release potassium, we actually might have saw about a 4 bushel yield increase. And when we look at the banding, 13 bushel yield response with 100% of that potash banded directly underneath the row. This is by far not a sulfur responsive site. We saw that we had 249 bushels with just 75 pounds of K2O banded underneath that row. That placement effect was upwards of 27 bushels per acre. Again, this is yet another study just showing the difference of trying to fight K fixation with just a broadcast application and trying to overcome that by concentrating and keeping them available longer. So overall key takeaways here, K fixation is going to be a major problem for a lot of guys, depending on if you're broadcasting or banding. Banding that is going to be a really good way to overcome it. You have to be a little bit careful on some sources, but from what we've seen, for the most part, banding potassium fertilizers is a lot safer than what we originally would have thought. I will say that you have to make sure that your toolbar is actually, the fertilizer is hitting the bottom of the trench, but for the most part, if you have that placement pretty good, banding K fertilizers should not be too much of a problem at all. So final takeaways. We wanted to know, what was the strategy for winning the NCGA corn yield contest, right? We said that it starts with better crop nutrition. We're going to achieve that through better placement. That, we got to figure out which are our racehorse hybrids. We're making sure we're picking the right hybrid for the right acre. If I get that right, I need to make sure that crop is never stressed. And you do that by making sure those nutrients are available all season long. Now, as I said in the beginning, that's a lot easier said than done. And I know myself, I could not do it all by myself. I would have to rely on this team right here. We have Dr. Bilo, our fearless leader right there, our research specialist, Julianne Seebauer, and the team of strong minds and strong backs all about right there, helping us with all those root digs and planting in 35-degree weather.
We also could not do it with this list of financial and product support that we had for 2020. This is in alphabetical order, not in the amount that anybody gave. I can tell you that none of this research would be possible without the generous contributions of time, money, and resources into our program. We wouldn't be able to bring this research to you without this amazing list of sponsors right here. So big shout out to them. And then also thank you to our crop physiology lab site and farm cooperators. We've worked with the Stewarts up in Yorkville, everybody at the U of I campus in Champaign, the great work by our farm crew helping us out. And then down south in Ewing, we've worked with Talon Becker at the University Extension site, and then also now with Bartling Farms in Nashville, Illinois. We really rely on a lot of collaboration with people even outside of the university system. We've worked with some growers down in southern Indiana, Banded Ag, trying to put some of these practices into a real life system. So really a lot of the community effort across the state working to see how some of these practices work. And then lastly, I'd also like to give a big shout out to the University of Illinois, the Agronomy Day, for everybody that's helped put these videos together for you guys. And then also Montag Manufacturing for helping record this session. Without them, you guys wouldn't really be able to get to see this great presentation with the great audio and video. And then also, if you guys want any more information, we have our crop physiology laboratory website down here. Not all of our information is on this website. We take care of the website in our free time, which means pretty much never. But please reach out to this website or out to Dr. Bilo or myself if you guys have any more questions or want a little bit more of this information. So thank you guys very much and have a good one.